Well, hello. Well, thank you for joining us for our event on hiring in a candidates market. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Peter Franks. I'm the founder of a headhunting firm called Neon River. And we specialize in working with high growth internet, software, and broader technology companies. And yeah, I guess what we're keen to cover today is some of the tips and tricks, I guess, you can use to, I guess, hopefully make hiring a little bit easier in what is, often quite a tough kind of candidates market where, it's not easy filling positions and where, often there's a lot of demand for the same candidates. I've got my colleague Yui joining me, who's going to be helping me. And we're keen to make this as interactive as possible. So if you do have any questions or any themes that you'd like us to address, then obviously do submit them through the chat functionality, and it'd be great to get your thoughts. So without further ado, we'll get into the I guess the subject matter at hand. And I'm keen to try and make this as practical as possible, because I'm very conscious of the fact that we can chat at a high level about these kinds of themes, but hopefully one thing I can do is use some of the experience I've got and some of the tips and tricks that I've learned over the years in order to make this hopefully a little bit easier if anyone's facing kind of similar challenges. Now, I've prepared a little presentation that will go through some of the themes, I guess, that we're discussing today. And so, without further ado, I shall start taking you through that. Now, hopefully, you can start seeing my screen. And yeah, a little bit of brief kind of background on me. So I've been working in search headhunting ever since I was a graduate, kind of back in the day. Sadly, now I'm 40 years old, so I'm no longer a young pup. But hopefully, that experience could be helpful here. Now, when we talk about a candidates market, what do we really mean? It means that obviously the demand for certain types of candidates are massively outstripping their supply. And that has, I think, several consequences. It means that firstly, the adverts don't tend to work well. When you've got candidates who being approached by lots of different recruiters all the time, they don't feel that they need to respond to job adverts. They're probably not actively looking. There's plenty of suitors for their demand, which means that regardless of whether you work for a headhunting firm or a recruitment agency, or whether you work in-house, you're probably going to need to start approaching candidates directly in order to engage and persuade those passive candidates there's a bigger, better, sexier job opportunity out there for them. And so that also has the consequence of pushing up salaries. Whenever we're in a candidates market, it pushes the cost of labor, the price of labor, I guess, ultimately up, and therefore candidates have to feel confident that any potential suitor has the financial means to be able to attract them as well. So obviously all of these competing factors, whether it's increased demands, competition for the same candidates, the more expensive to close, obviously makes our job as recruiters considerably harder in order to execute our searches. Now, something I wanted to touch on a little bit at quite a high level, but without going into too much detail, is around how you think about branding your company and I guess kind of the overall kind of candidate experience. And I use that phrase, candidate experience, very intentionally, because I think a lot of the areas in which recruitment processes can go wrong tend to have unintended negative kind of consequences of an emotional variety on your candidates, i.e., they don't make candidates feel good. And therefore, what we've got to try and do when we construct a recruitment process is we've got to try and make that candidate experience as strong as possible. Now, you can think of it a little bit like a funnel. Just as how marketeers or salespeople often talk about a funnel when they're selling a product or a service to somebody, it's a similar kind of concept in recruitment. So obviously, at the bottom end of our funnel, or my triangle, I guess, as it is in this case, you've got the actual offer process that you make to a candidate. But all the stages before that, whether it's the interview process where you're considering multiple candidates, or indeed way before people have even considered applying for your job, these all have a huge degree of influence over whether you're going to get a successful placement at the end. Because only certain companies have such a strong employer brand and such a strong reputation that they don't have to work on it. If you're Apple or Google or Facebook or someone like that, you probably don't need to work that hard on your employer brand because it sells itself. But for the majority of companies, you do a little bit. That could be because you're a small company, candidates don't know you. It could be that maybe you exist in a sector where it's just not that sexy for whatever reason. Someone I know really well, who's a client of ours, works for a company where essentially they act as an affiliate to online gambling companies. They help to drive traffic through owning various websites to online gambling companies. Now, a lot of candidates would morally object to working for a business like this, who they might perceive, encourages people to gamble, which they might perceive to not be an ethical thing to do. So what this company has done is they put a huge amount of effort in terms of building out their employer brand. That means, interviews with the CEO and thought leadership and white papers and that kind of thing. But also, it doesn't just mean showcasing your C-level staff. It means, what is it really like? Spend a day in the life of a software engineer or a product manager or a marketeer or whatever it may be, within our business, that helps it to really come to life. Show why, from a cultural perspective, this is a great company to work for. Be conscious of all the sort of online touch points where candidates and consumers might research your business, particularly things like Glassdoor. Many companies have quite poor ratings on Glassdoor, and that's something you can address. You can encourage employees that are happy working there to give you 4- and 5-star reviews, and that can have a massive influence on your ability to attract talent. So try and think about the company that you're representing, whether you work in-house or whether you work for an external agency, as objectively as possible. Try and put yourself in the shoes of a candidate who doesn't really know much about the business, the sort of things they might do or be interested in order to research the business. And then hopefully you can create a sort of online presence and a series of articles and events that help to promote your business as being hopefully the genuinely innovative, attractive, nice place to work that hopefully it is. Now, I'm not going to go too deep around these kind of themes, because I think we're starting to drift into kind of HR territory and that sort of thing, which is not really my specialism. But of course, these things are extremely important, and particularly if you work in-house for a company, I think thinking about how do you build your employer brand and make yourself therefore as attractive as possible to candidates before they're in your recruitment process is definitely something to consider. I think from here, we're going to focus a lot more on some of the more sort of practical, tangible, technical aspects of recruitment, not least because I guess that's I guess our specialism, and that's really what we do. So, as I talked about a little bit earlier, a lot of I guess how we can measure the success of a recruitment process is how you make candidates feel. And I've described it as good and bad recruitment processes here, but you could equally describe it as effective or ineffective recruitment processes if you want to take the kind of slightly moral tone of good and bad out of it. So bad recruitment processes are slow, they're impersonal, they're bureaucratic. People don't give candidates proper feedback. They go quiet on them. They don't manage their expectations. So candidates feel like a kind of disposable piece of meat, like a sausage in the sausage factory, that they're just there to be grilled and got back to whenever the company or the recruiter deigns to. And it's maybe you can get away with that if you're Apple or Google or Facebook, but for 99% of companies, that's not going to work very well for you. It's going to leave a bad taste in the mouth of candidates. By contrast, what we want to do is we want to be fast. Now, momentum is super important in recruitment processes. The quicker you can get candidates through the process whilst obviously assessing them properly, the more they're going to like you, the more that sort of positive momentum is going to sweep them off their feet. It's a bit like, and you have to forgive me, I'm a lover of cheesy analogies, but it's a bit like a dating process. If it's going to be 10 dates before you're my boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever, then it's a bit of a big sort of barrier to entry. It's going to put a lot of people off along the way. So try and not make your processes too lengthy. Try and cut down the number of stakeholders beyond those that are truly important and essential to the process. Giving timely, detailed feedback to candidates is probably the number one sin of all recruiters, and I totally get it. We're all busy. Switching off candidates is probably the task that I enjoy doing the least, as important as it is, because you build a relationship with candidates. For whatever reason, they haven't made it through the process. But the least you can do as a recruiter is give them timely, detailed, practical feedback, because ultimately the candidate has bothered to take time out of their day to come and meet with you, meet with your clients, go through your process. Even if it's a no, you owe them at least good detailed feedback that they can use and that will hopefully help them for other processes. And particularly if you work for an agency, this stuff is really, really important. A lot of my clients are former candidates that really like working with me because I cared, because I went that extra mile, because I gave them proper feedback, because I prepared them ahead of interview stages in terms of what to expect. And therefore, I wasn't just treating them as a piece of meat in order to get paid and get my placement. I was treating them as I would want to be treated myself. And therefore, I became a trusted advisor, I became someone they liked working with, and they became clients of mine. And so I think it's particularly important, particularly as a young kind of inexperienced recruiter, to build relationships with candidates, because obviously it'll help you to get your placement because they'll think more highly of you, you'll be able to influence them more. But also in the longer term, these guys can become your clients. So if we move on to the next slide, I don't have a silver bullet when it comes to recruiting in a candidate's market. There isn't one tool or one technique you can use that solves this problem. But I think what's always helpful is when you're presented with a challenge that is substantial. I've got to find a software engineering director where there's intense competition for talent. It's always helpful to break down a really thorny problem and try to analyze it as objectively and as analytically as you can. So it's very simplistic, I know, but at a high level, what we've got to do is two things. We've got to maximize the supply of candidates, and we've got to maximize their conversion. So if we can increase the supply of relevant candidates, obviously there's no point going after candidates that aren't going to solve the problem. And then if we can maximize the conversion of those candidates, then that should hopefully have a very positive effect in terms of solving our recruitment process. Now, if we look at these themes, I guess, kind of in turn, both from the supply side and from the demand side, I guess, for candidates, how do we increase the supply of candidates? The market's changed massively over the last kind of 10, 15, 20 years with the rise of LinkedIn. Doing what I do, which is being a headhunter, and versus working in-house for a company in a recruitment capacity, they've become much closer conceptually, right? Headhunting is no longer this kind of thing where we're lurking in the shadows and waiting to strike. We're all using pretty much the same tools. We're all using LinkedIn, etc., as a fantastic resource that it is for finding candidates. In my experience, most of the projects that we end up working on, our clients and probably their HR/recruitment departments have had a crack at hiring the position, and it just hasn't worked for whatever reason. My observation, I guess, would be, I think a lot of internal recruitment folks and HR folks, it's around how you segment the market where there's definitely areas for improvement. Now, keyword searches are one thing. We all love a good keyword search, right? You're looking for a CMO for an internet company who's got really good acquisition skills. So, you Google paid search and SEM and all these kinds of things, and it comes up with candidates. That's great. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. But I think what is more disciplined, what is more thorough, what is a more deep segmentation is to formally map out the relevant sectors. And that's what we do as headhunting firms. And it takes time and resource to do it, but it's incredibly powerful. So think about what the relevant sector and industry requirements are for your position. So I'm a tech headhunter, so I work mostly for kind of B2C internet companies, mobile businesses and games companies, but also for B2B software and technology companies. But just for, I guess, the accessibility purposes of this discussion, let's assume we're talking about internet companies. So I'm working for an internet business. It's a £10 million revenue, fairly entrepreneurial company that's growing quickly. They're looking to hire their first chief marketing officer, and they want somebody with strong performance marketing skills, particularly around acquisition and retention and that sort of thing. Now, we can break down the internet space into subcategories like retail, like online travel, like marketplaces, like subscription entertainment products like Netflix and Spotify and that kind of thing, like fintech businesses, price comparison websites, news and media sites, social media sites. So if you break down the internet space into however sizable, sensible categories you think there are, could be 10, could be 15, could be 20, and then you populate, and you do this in a really systematic way, those industries and sub-industries with real companies. So you think, okay, who are the players in Europe from an online travel perspective? Okay, it's Booking.com, it's Expedia, it's Skyscanner, etc. And formally make a list of these companies. You might end up with a segmented list of companies that could be 50 or 100 companies strong. And I bet you if you systematically research those companies, you will find way more potential candidates for your position than if you do sort of keyword searches. The trouble with keyword searches is they're only as good as how much candidates bother to tell you about themselves. I might be the best digital marketer in the world, but if I've just put on my LinkedIn titles, job titles and companies, I'm not hitting your keyword search, even though I'm a relevant candidate. So keyword searches are good. They're a bit lazy in terms of how much of the market they cover, and therefore you've got to understand that the market is a mess. There's no one methodology that we can use that hits all the right candidates at once. Instead, what we've got to do is we've got to try a bunch of different theses, which could be different keyword searches around different themes. It could be around systematically researching through certain companies. And if we try all these different things, then the chances of us maximizing the supply of candidates is very high. But you've got to have that discipline to cover the market. Many times, clients come to us and say, "Oh no, we cover the market. We couldn't find anybody." You didn't. You barely touched the sides of the market. There's probably half the market that you didn't even find, and that's understandable. But if you follow these different methodologies and if you're disciplined, then you will unearth more candidates. So I think go into the detail, really break down your space, break down the companies that exist within that space, create a formal target landscape that defines your industry segmentation, and then systematically research that. And I bet you'll find a bunch of candidates. That's probably where 80% of your candidates might come from. Now, another trick you can use in a tough, challenging kind of market is looking internationally. Obviously, we exist in a culture at the moment where increasingly companies are hiring remotely, or at least they're hybrid in terms of their hiring philosophy. And in Europe in particular, probably the two biggest hubs are London and Berlin. Now, if you're hiring for certain positions, let's say engineering flavored positions, super tough finding candidates in places like London and Berlin, because you might have someone who's a software engineer who's never managed somebody in their life, paid a salary of £120,000 because that's the candidates market that we live in. So you may not be able to get them because every single day they're getting 5 approaches from different recruiters on LinkedIn and they're happy doing what they're doing. So the strategy they use is just to engage nobody. So you can send them all the emails that you like, you're not converting them as a candidate. Now, thankfully, we exist in a world where, talent is ubiquitous. And actually, often there's people who, exist and have grown up in countries where they don't have this big tech ecosystem, but they're just as clever and just as talented as people who do grow up in those kinds of hubs. But they just haven't had the career opportunities in their local market. So I'll be thinking of places like Spain and Portugal. I'll be thinking about markets in Eastern Europe, for example, where there just aren't that same sort of volume of local opportunities. And therefore, if you can give someone the opportunity to work for a Western business, that's quite attractive in terms of their career development prospects, even if it does require relocation. A lot of these candidates would love to come and work in a bigger hub and to have a bit of a international experience and journey and that sort of thing. Plus, you can often get them at a price point that might be a third, half as expensive as candidates in these other hubs, and they're just as good and just as talented. So think creatively. Everyone's going after the obvious candidates who work for the obvious companies in the obvious locations. Is there a trick? Is there somewhere you can look where there's a nice little hidden nest of talents that is accessible, that's gettable, that's cheaper than the obvious places where everyone looks? It's definitely something to think about. Now, the other thing, which I think a lot of recruiters underutilize, is what we call sourcing. Now, sourcing in a kind of headhunter parlance is this idea that we're going to approach someone who isn't a candidate themselves, but who may know the right person, either because maybe they work in the right industry, or maybe even though they're not in quite the right function, they're functionally close to what we're looking for. Maybe they're too senior and the role is too junior for them. We're going to flag that so we don't offend them, but we're going to ask them for help. Now, this is a super effective way of zooming in on a few high quality candidates quickly. It's not going to build out your entire candidate list, and you might get referred to a few wrong people, but you might also get referred to absolute winners, because obviously as recruiters, we're mostly judging candidates by profile, but that's not the same thing as how effective somebody is obviously in the role. So if you can get a referral from a credible industry contact who says, I work with Johnny and Johnny's really, really good for XYZ reasons, it means you can be pretty sure that Johnny's a good candidate, but also it means that when you put Johnny forward to meet with the line manager or whoever's doing the ultimate hiring, then it gives you a solid reason, aside from your qualification of the candidate, to be recommending that person. Furthermore, if you work for a recruitment agency, it can be a nice little way of doing business development. If there's somebody you're trying to get in with, who's a potential client of yours and that sort of thing, sourcing them and therefore sort of subtly advertising, oh, look, I'm playing in your space, and it gives you an excuse to talk to them and to hopefully build a deeper relationship with them. Now, there's two ways fundamentally you can do sourcing. There's the kind of the long way, which is the best way, but quite time consuming, which is setting up, doing it in a very tailored way, setting up calls with a handful of cherry picked, tailored folks that you want to source. Now, ultimately, you're not going to be able to have the time to do this 100 times. So what you might want to do is do more of a quick and what I call a sort of quick and dirty sourcing. Now, what I mean by that is, and you've got to be careful in terms of how you do this, but you can email source 50 or 100 industry contacts at once. Now, when you do so, you've got to be careful. Number one, you've got to try and personalize it as much as possible. So you can use mail merges using tools like Word and Outlook so that it personalizes the first name. So it's not, do not be sending senior industry contacts generic emails that say, hi, no name, generic thing. Don't do that. But if you personalize the name, so it says, hi, Peter, hi, John, hi, Sarah, etc. And obviously you're very careful about who you send it to, and you make it clear in the note, I'm not headhunting you for this. I would be super grateful if you could recommend someone. And then if you're very clear in bullet points about what you're looking for, so I'm looking for a CMO for an internet business, someone with strong performance marketing skills, someone ideally who can manage an acquisition budget of $20 million and who can lead a cross-functional marketing team of 15 people, and maybe in this sort of price range, then hopefully, you make their job easy in terms of coming back to you. Now, if you do that, the trouble with doing these kind of mass sourcey kind of things is inevitably you probably will send it to someone who maybe you shouldn't, just because they get lost in the shuffle a little bit. Or maybe there is a slight risk that someone might come up and go, oh, why are you asking me to do your job for you? In which case, like, a good response is, look, sorry, and look, I'm not trying to, I'm not trying to sort of take advantage of you or whatever, but obviously, it's my job to try and find the best candidate I can. And obviously part of that is, asking trusted industry contacts if you're not good. And I completely understand if you don't want to do that, no problem. Sorry for asking. But to be honest, only a very small percentage of candidates will do that. And you'll find that a lot of people will be happy to help because either they want to help their friend out or they want to build a relationship with you and help you out. So I think you can do it either way, but if you're going to do it in more of a mass way, obviously be careful around how you do that, because you don't want to offend the other person either by pitching them something that's too junior or just irrelevant for them, or by not personalizing your approach enough, so it just makes them feel not very special. But it can definitely be a super effective tool. If we move on a little bit to talking about candidate conversion, so this is, I guess, how do we get candidates through the door? So we found them, now how do we get them? Now, the initial approach is absolutely essential, whether that's an initial telephone call, whether it's an in-mail, whether it's an email. I call it the shop window. And this is against, a backdrop of candidates that are being bombarded by in-house recruiters, by external recruiters, by headhunters, saying we've got all these opportunities. And so that sort of shallow first note that you send someone is incredibly important in terms of whether you're going to get them on the phone or not. As I mentioned on this slide, one thing we've got to avoid is underpowered job titles, because they're an absolute disaster. Often, particularly if you're working with entrepreneurial early stage companies, they're worried about title inflation. They're worried about, crikey, if I make this person a VP or a C-level person, what if other people want that? What if we have to hire someone more senior because they can't grow with the company. I totally get all those objections, but the reality is, if you're looking for a CTO and you're calling it head of engineering or you're calling it engineering manager, big trouble for the recruiter, because you're competing against a bunch of other opportunities that will call it CTO, that will call it VP engineering, and therefore that will massively reduce the amount of candidates you get on the phone straight away. It might chop it down by 50, 60, 70, 80%. So you've got to have confidence as a recruiter before the project starts, before it's too late, before you found out this the hard way, to push back on line managers if they're going with underpowered job titles, because they've got to understand, it's a war for talent out there. And if we're going out with broken weapons and, armor with lots of holes in it from the start, we're going to be doomed to failure. Now, one thing we've got to try and do when we approach candidates is give them enough information so they can qualify the opportunity. I can't just approach someone and go, hey, I'm Peter Franks, I'm a big deal, I've got something for you, you should chat to me. That's not going to get anyone on the phone because everyone's busy, they don't know who I am. We've got to give them a reason. So I've got to tell them enough about the opportunity at a high level so that they can qualify it. But I also want to leave a little bit of mystique and intrigue in there. I don't want to tell candidates who the company is before I've spoken to them on the phone, not because there's anything to be ashamed about, but because I want to put it in context. I want to verbally pitch the role. And of course, my mission is to get them on that phone if I can. Now, one technique you can use that's helpful is really making the role come to life and making it sound really interesting. Now, I think when you're young and when you're inexperienced, there's a tendency, particularly in the tech space, to want to kind of overcomplicate everything, right? So, there's loads of buzzwords and acronyms. So if I just trot all those out, it will sound really eloquent and sophisticated, and I'll sound like I really know what I'm talking about. But actually, often that's counterproductive, right? I can talk about, chief product officers and DevOps and agile systems and so forth, but that's just buzzwords. It doesn't really, bring it to life. What we want to do is we want to make this role seem extremely influential in terms of its importance within the context of the business. And one way you can do that is by using questions, right? So I can describe it as a chief product officer role, and people know what that means. Nothing in my question is, massively surprising of what sort of things a chief product officer might look at. But what it does do is illustrate in a hopefully very accessible way, and I'm literally going to put these questions in my approach email, why it's an important and fundamental role. So how do we price our products in different international markets? What features do we need to stay ahead of the competition? How do we personalize our user experience based on all these different personas, different kinds of users that we have? All three things, pricing, building out features, personalization, very standard for chief product officer roles. But tell the candidate what this person is going to be doing. That sounds much more interesting than, oh yes, I'm looking for a chief product officer for a high growth fintech business. It's just like, great, but make the role come to life. Why is this such a cool role in the context of the business? Because it's deciding all these really important things. So don't be tempted to make things more complicated and use buzzwords. Be tempted to do the opposite. Make it simple, accessible, understandable, because people don't value things they don't understand, right? And so you want to make your pitches accessible to the man or woman on the street, not requiring a dictionary and an encyclopedia to be able to understand. The best pitches are short, simple, memorable, and create a feeling in the user. Buzzwords and complicated tech babble doesn't really do that so much. So try not to do that if you can. Now, if we're talking about kind of more general tips for candidate conversion, number one, we always want to try and get candidates on the phone if we can before sending them job descriptions, before telling them who the company is. Now, sometimes we have to do those things because candidates are jaded by recruiters wasting their time and therefore they insist on them before approaching. But bear in mind, obviously, that a verbal pitch you give is always going to be more engaging, it always puts it in a context, it always gives a degree of color that no documentation ever can. So it's always better to try and do the verbal pitch if you can get them on the phone first. Don't oversell to candidates on compensation, right? Classic question from a candidate is, oh, how much does the role pay? Can you give me a salary range? Be very conscious of the fact that all offers are bespoke to different candidates. Throwing out salary ranges in early stages without caveats is super risky because candidates will hear and remember the high end of the range, If they get to offer stage, they may not get offered the high end of the range because they're way more junior than that. They may reject the offer or bitch and moan to the hiring manager about, oh, I thought it paid 150K base when they've got a 120K offer. And you're going to get a bunch of crap for it because you've misset their expectations, and that's your fault. So don't oversell to candidates on package. It's very tempting to be generous with other people's money. It's very tempting to just shout out the highest number that the line manager told you because it helps you to attract candidates, but it's misleading because not every candidate's going to get that. They might be willing to pay that for a superstar, super experienced senior candidate. They might be willing to pay that much, but not for the up and comer. So be conscious that compensation is bespoke, and don't oversell to candidates on that early because it may come back to bite you. Yeah, never use a phone script. I think no headhunter gives completely unique pitches to every candidate. But the second you sound like you're reading from a script, it really lessens the impact of what you do. And actually, it makes you seem junior and people stop listening to you. And part of the ways you can avoid sounding scripty while still having a structure to your pitch is by changing the pace at which you speak. If I'm suddenly getting faster and getting excited about something and actually throwing passion into it, and then sometimes I'm slowing down and talking more slowly, that's more natural. Because if I'm reading from a script or reading something, I tend to do it in this very kind of even staccato way where there's a rhythm to what I'm saying, which is very even, and people don't really talk that way. Also, what you want to do is you want to try and get louder and quieter and change the sort of crescendo and diminuendo, to use a musical term, of your voice. Because again, if your voice sounds really flat and I sound like I'm bored by what I'm saying, then there's no real incentive for someone else to be super interested in this stuff. So I've got to sound like I'm interested in it. And therefore, I'm going to get loud and get a bit more excited when I'm talking about certain things. So try and sound excited about the opportunity. I don't mean like be super cheesy and lay it on too thick, like, cool, this is the best chief product officer role I've ever seen. Yeah, crikey. In fact, thinking about quitting headhunting and doing it myself, that sells in cheesy. Don't do that. Equally, you've got to sound excited about the opportunity, because if you don't sound excited about it, if you don't sound like you're passionate about it, why the hell should anyone else be? So, even though it might be your 60th pitch and you might feel like, bloody hell, I wish they hired someone by now, try and sound enthusiastic, because if you don't sound enthusiastic when you're selling something, then why should anyone buy it, quite frankly? And yeah, as we talked about before, intrigue is a powerful tool. Balance, telling them enough so they can qualify, but leave a little bit of mystique in there. So for example, if I'm doing a project in Spain for a Spanish company and I'm approaching a candidate in Spain, I'm going to tell them it's a Spanish company on my approach note, just to create a little bit of intrigue. Ooh, I wonder who that is. Or if the candidate is a super deep expert in some sort of sector and I'm working for a startup in that sector, I might talk a lot about how it's a super innovative business in XYZ kind of space, because I know they've got an interest in that sector, and I know they'll be thinking, I wonder who this is. So personalize your messages around the backgrounds of the people that you're speaking to, and think about clever ways in which you can create that little bit of intrigue, that little bit of mystique, that little bit of curiosity in them, that might just be the thing that helps your message to stand out amongst the 5 other approaches they had that day from different kinds of suitors. Let's imagine we've actually got the candidate on the phone, and now we're talking about this real kind of opportunity with them. Obviously, every company and every role is different in terms of having different requirements, different things that we're looking for. But there's several themes that kind of emerge once you've done this for a while that you can broadly kind of adapt to different kinds of scenarios. And I've described 3 of them kind of here that I've used over the years. The first is the scale pitch, right? And this is perhaps the easiest one of all, right? Because in my experience, and obviously people are different, but most candidates love the security that bigger companies give them, because they feel that the company's not likely to go bust, and therefore I'm not likely to be made redundant tomorrow, and B, I can have a huge degree of resources and influence to be able to do the things that I want to do. So the scale pitch works best for big roles, or not necessarily big roles, but big companies where there's big numbers we can use to illustrate the point. So this person's going to be managing a big team, big revenues, big geographies in the context of a big business that's raised lots of money from all these prestigious investors. So maybe it's a Google, it's a Facebook, maybe it's a big private equity-backed company where we can say, look at the team size, look at the budget, look at the scale, look at the revenues, scale, everything's big, look how important this is, right? That's a scale pitch, and it's very effective. Now, obviously, if you're working for earlier stage entrepreneurial businesses, they can't give you a scale pitch because they're not big, right? So teams aren't big, revenues aren't big, profits aren't big, right? So what we need to do now is we need to do a bit more of an evangelical kind of conceptual pitch, because often what these companies are doing is looking to change the world or do something in a more innovative way. Now, there could be something, in a very grandiose B2C, we've got this super funky new internet product in this category that no one's thought of before. Or it could just be, an early stage B2B business isn't going to change the world, but it's going to do something software-y or in a technological sense, maybe in a B2B sense, better than has been done before. So what we want to try and do when we're pitching these opportunities to candidates, and going back to my earlier point, is make them really accessible, right? Because they ain't going to be an expert probably in this sector or this new thing that the company that you're representing is doing. So you want to make it really easy to understand and get why you might be able to build a really successful business out of this idea. So the example that I'm using kind of below is, we're working with this e-learning business. A lot of parents feel that their kids spend too much time, on YouTube, online, watching crap basically, and therefore they feel better if there was at least they could spend some of their free time, on this educational product. And so our client's got this e-learning app that teaches kids aged between the ages of 2 and 8 how to learn English. So obviously it's aimed at people who don't speak English as their primary language. It's a subscription product that costs about $15 a month. So hopefully it can sit nicely, alongside a Netflix subscription or a gym membership. It's a very visual product, so it's extremely engaging for kids. There's a parents area, so parents can see how their kids are doing and do exercises together. And so now I'm pitching it in a sort of down-to-earth way, because I'm hoping that the audience member goes, oh yeah, I've got kids, and I worry that they spend too much time on their computers and they're not really learning enough. So actually, I could see why I might want to work for a company like this. So it's bringing it down and making it accessible. What I'm not doing is going, oh yes, I'm working with a e-learning business that specializes in XYZ learning, and using all these highfalutin kind of words. Yeah, they're great, but but so fucking what? Why should I care about this business? So don't hide behind keywords and acronyms. Understand what a business is trying to do. Make it simple. How do you describe what this business does in like 20 seconds, 3 sentences, that you could go out into the street right now and pick anyone, not some tech industry enthusiast, and they'd get it? That's the trick. How do you describe these kind of entrepreneurial opportunities well? Now, I use the e-learning example. There's other, look, that's not, you might hear me saying, okay, that's great, fucking B2C e-learning business, but what relevance is that to, B2B SaaS company? Well, it could be the case that, okay, so we've got a B2B SaaS product that just does some area of software better than has been done before. You've got a lot of these big existing ERP systems like SAP, which are fantastic if you're a great big company that ships products all around the world. But if you're a small business and actually you need an ERP system that does employee benefits really well, that's what we specialize in. And actually we do that really much better. And actually employee benefits are becoming increasingly important to different companies as a way of differentiating against their competitors. In fact, research shows that benefits are highly valued by 80% of employees when they're considering changing jobs, or whatever the stat is. So it doesn't have to be this kind of we're going to change the world B2C thing. You've just got to make them understand, why is this product better than what's come before, and what's the market for this? Can I see them building a sizable business out of this thing? The other kind of pitch that's worth having in your back pocket is what I call the influence pitch. Now, influence is a super important theme, whether you're working for a big company, a small company, or a medium-sized company. Everyone wants to have influence, right? But this is what I especially mean in this context is in a kind of turnaround type context, because sometimes you work for a company where actually maybe things aren't going that well. Maybe it's not that sexy a brand. Maybe candidates research your business, and there's all these news articles about how the company's struggling and laying off people and how things aren't going so well. And you might think that that's an absolute disaster when it comes to recruiting people, but it isn't, because influence is the #1 driver for most candidates. Not money, it's influence, the ability to make a difference and to be appreciated when you do that. So how you can pitch this is almost make the candidates seem like they're our hero, they're Superman, they're going to be coming in and helping us to fix. You can be really honest about all these issues. We've got problems in terms of, okay, we're working for a big traditional offline business. It's now just transitioning into getting into digital. They don't have a very big internet business at the moment. Amazon and all these other big pure play internet businesses are kicking their ass. But this is an opportunity for you to go in and to really shape, how do we do e-commerce? How do we do it really well? So you can be very honest about all these negatives and question marks and turn them into positives by saying, this is your opportunity to make a difference. And if you can come into a business like this and turn it around and improve all these things that we've talked about, think what that's going to do for your career prospects. I might want to head on you to be the CEO of a company like this next, if you can do all these wonderful things. So don't be scared by negative PR, by difficult company situations, by bad press. Turn it into an advantage. Be honest about those things and tell them about how they can make a difference in that sort of context. And last but not least, candidate experience is key. Ultimately, how you feel about something is probably at least 50% of my experience. If you feel negatively about something, probably at least 50% of the time, you're just not going to do it. Heart rules head, and it's just as important. And I think it's often neglected a little bit in these kind of recruitment processes. So as we talked about before, if we're slow, we don't give candidates proper feedback, we don't prepare them before interviews or help them succeed. We don't set their expectations in terms of timing or get a sense of whether they prefer our opportunity to other competitive opportunities. Very easy for them to feel like a piece of meat, and therefore very easy for them to say no to us. The flip side is, good candidates have competitive opportunities, right? They're probably looking, there's probably other companies that like them for the same reasons that you do, or that the company that you're working for does. The deeper relationship you can build with a candidate is going to give you a competitive advantage. It's going to make you, understand the competition, and therefore the things you need to do in terms of your process in order to make sure that you're hopefully outperforming this other process. But also it creates an emotional bond where they don't want to let you down. They don't want to let the company down. So the more you do for candidates, the more you give them proper feedback, the more you set their expectations ahead of meetings, the more you chat to them and get a sense of where they are with other processes. These are all super helpful bits of information and bits of relationship building that will make a humongous difference in terms of whether you whether you succeed, whether they accept your offer, or whether they accept another one. I think the final sort of bullet in one's armory, I guess, so to speak, is documentation. And this is another, like job descriptions, this is another key area in which companies, in my opinion, often let themselves down. Now, I'm going to show you a job description that we wrote for a recent client, Lingo Kids, which is this mobile-based e-learning product for kids. Now, I've gone with a funky blue and lime green color scheme because that's their brand colors. Obviously, for a different client, I'd be doing this in more of a kind of conservative kind of way. But the point is, it took me most of a day to write this, but it's worth it because I can give the candidate a pretty good verbal pitch on the phone, but it's this document that they review in the cold light of day on a Sunday morning that you converts candidates or not. And to be honest, most client job specs are rubbish. They are boring Word documents. They don't tell you nearly enough about the business. They're too wordy. The descriptions of what they're looking for are too long and often filled with, frankly, irrelevant detail that doesn't really influence the ultimate hiring decision. Whereas really what we want to do is create this visual document, do it in PowerPoint, that really spends 75% of the time telling you about the company, who they are, what they do, frankly, why you should want to work for them, and then 25% on what we're looking for in you. This is a key sales document. So what we're doing here is, again, funky, right? We're trying to make it visual. It's context around the business, stuff around the product, how it works. Okay, we've got accreditations in terms of how it's a safe product. Okay, we've got some example videos in terms of things people can learn using the products. we got a review from the App Store telling us how wonderful this product is. We've got a bunch of stats to help us to sell to candidates and illustrate the proposition. We've raised 62.5 million in funding, got 30 million families around the world who've downloaded the app. Headcount's doubled in the last 2 years. Revenues are growing 50% year on year. These are all stats to help us to illustrate and why you should want to work for this company. It's not a lazy copy and paste from the website as most job descriptions are. Background on the management team helps us to sell to candidates. Describing the opportunity. And we're talking about, when we're describing the role responsibilities, which again, we're trying to make it sound exciting and influential. We're not saying you must have 5 years experience of managing designers. Who cares? Like whether you've got 5 years or 10 years or 12 years or 7.5 years. I'm not saying that's irrelevant. It's not the reason why you hire a candidate. And so be the voice of the customer throughout Lingo Kids. Lead the product design. It's these power first words. Define processes. Build strong relationships, right? It's making it sound interesting. It's not, these sort of dry, let me grill you on, how many years of leadership experience. Like, it doesn't really matter. That's not why you hire somebody. Again, I'm not writing a bazillion bullet points in terms of what we're looking for, because people don't care about that. It's these big themes. Sector experience. Okay, you're going to be a UX specialist. You're going to be a designer and have credibility with the team. You'll be able to lead user research as a function. A little bit at the end about us. So spend more time on writing job descriptions, because ultimately they're helpful. They're just as helpful as a verbal pitch when it comes to closing candidates. So that's it in terms of the material that I prepared. But any questions from the audience? It doesn't look so. I hope I haven't bored people too much by rabbiting on, but hopefully that's helpful. Yui, any questions, or are we dealing with some shy recruiters?
No, actually, we haven't got questions yet, so...
Cool, no worries. Well, I've been waxing lyrical now for 47 minutes, so thank you for attending the event. And any questions, obviously, let me know. Drop me an email to peter@neonriver.com. And yeah, thank you for taking the time to